You in the meeting?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've begun. Welcome everybody.
I'll put on headphones.
Thank you.
Everybody please mute themselves. The 2020, 2021 sentence, if ever there was one, please mute yourself. My name's Stephen Ross. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English at Concordia, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be hosting this Zoom launch of Professor Nathan Brown's Rationalist Empiricism, a Theory of Speculative Critique. Here it is. Hopefully you all have copies as well. This is the launch that's the official Center for Expanded Poetics launch, of which Nathan is, of course, the director. And what we have planned for this launch is, first of all, to give Nathan an opportunity to give a paper or a lecture about the book and its intervention. And I think that's going to be about 40 to 45 minutes, you said, Nathan?
About 35 to 40.
35 minutes, okay, great. And after that, our colleague, Professor Manish Sharma, will be a respondent to the talk and to the book more generally. And after that conversation between Nathan and Manish, we'll open it up to questions from the group. And I don't want to be too long-winded in my introductory remarks. What I told Nathan is what I'll tell you all about this book. I aspire to be a serious reader of it. I don't feel like I'm quite there yet. It's as you'll find out, an extremely rich and provocative and also just very helpful book. But again, I don't even want to try to speak to it. I don't feel adequate. I also wanted to note that Nathan has an exceptional new project also about to come out. I'm not sure what the date is, Nathan, but you've sent me some of the proofs for the cover and the design. This is a 2-volume project on Baudelaire's Fleur de Mal, a complete translation of Fleur de Mal, and a monograph on Baudelaire and Fleur de Mal. So Baudelaire's Shadow, an essay on poetic determination is the monograph, and Flowers of Evil, of course, is the translation. That's coming out in 2 volumes from Mama, which Nathan, you can maybe say a bit more about them. It's a group in Croatia that you're, of course, very closely affiliated with and have been for many years. I've read the translation. I think some of you also are in Nathan's graduate seminar on Baudelaire this term, or will have read it otherwise. I've also read the monograph, and I bow down before this person and what he's able to do in so many different domains, as a translator, as a literary critic, as a philosopher, and as a thinker more generally. So again, without waxing too lyrical or being too long-winded, I'd like to just hand it over to Nathan, who will give his talk, and then I'll be sort of moderating events, and we'll go from there. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thanks so much to my dear friend Stephen Ross for that introduction. Please bow no longer. And it really is truly a pleasure to see so many people who I haven't seen in a long time. So many friends from Montreal, so many colleagues from elsewhere, and it's nice to be able to catch up even in this strange format. I guess you mentioned the release date of the Baudelaire materials. Those are going to come out on October 1st. But this is a book launch on Rationalist Empiricism, a Theory of Speculative Critique, which came out in January from Fordham. And you know, it's a book on philosophy, so I've tried to make this introduction accessible, but I think I've probably failed in that. There's no way to avoid getting into philosophical technicalities and getting into the system of references that the book deals with. So I hope that you'll forgive me that. But I've tried to prepare an introduction that will sort of traverse the different elements of the book and put forward different aspects of its argument and its attempt to make an intervention in the conjuncture of contemporary philosophy. And so I have actually written a paper, which is about 16 pages, so it should be about 35 to 40 minutes. And without further ado, I'll get into it. And then I'm looking forward to questions, a couple from Manish, and then we'll open it up to questions from everybody. So again, thanks so much everyone for coming. I really deeply appreciate it. So I think it's useful to introduce this book through the context and the process of its composition. And as I note in the acknowledgements to the book, the project really stems from a series of conferences organized by the Cornell Theory Reading Group, which I attended from 2008 to 2010. So this really is a book that has a very specific kind of institutional genesis and a series of conversations at those conferences. And among the many different concerns of contributors to those conferences, my sense was that there was a shared project of trying to take stock of the consequences of developments in contemporary French philosophy for our understanding of Kantian critique and German idealism. So the sequence of German philosophy from Kant to Hegel. And let me describe the situation in this way. So if we consider much of 20th century French theory or French philosophy as a series of engagements with the tradition of German thought, so for example, Lacan with Freud, Althusser with Marx, Foucault with Nietzsche, Derrida with Heidegger, then part of the task for a generation of theorists working through this larger tradition in the 1990s and the 2000s was to assess its results and try to carve out an approach to our own situation in the wake of it. And I would say that two factors made this a particularly complex situation in the early 2000s. One of them was the belated intervention of Alain Badiou's philosophy into that French sequence, with Being an Event published in 1988 and with its reception still underway in the early 2000s. And one major consequence of Badiou's work was a resurgence of philosophical rationalism, which revived a certain lesser known but crucial tradition in the French epistemology of science, running from figures like Albert Lautmann and Gaston Bachelard through Jean Cavaillez and Jean Tisset Desanti to Althusser and the group around the journal Cahiers pour l'Analyse. And on this aspect of 20th century French philosophy, I would really recommend Knox Peden's outstanding work of intellectual history, Spinoza contra Phenomenology, French Rationalism from Cavaillez to Deleuze. And then a second element specific to the situation around 2005 to 2010 was the challenge to the limits of Kant's critical philosophy put forward in Quentin Meillassoux' book, After Finitude. And however one viewed the critique of what Meillassoux called correlationism put forward in that book, it seemed to be a text in relation to which one had to take a position, since what was at stake was basically the question of whether philosophical speculation could or should be revived as a discourse on the absolute. So in what sense and in what way philosophy could go beyond the finite thinking of Kant and Heidegger to make claims about being in a manner separable from subjective conditions of knowledge. So these two factors, a resurgence of philosophical rationalism and renewed claims for the speculative scope of philosophy, reconfigured the question of how 20th century French thought had relayed and intervened in the trajectory of German philosophy from Kant to Heidegger. And as I tried to think through the stakes of that question, I came to see the problems at issue in methodological terms, particularly with respect to the centrality of Kant in modern philosophy. So I wasn't particularly interested in sort of glib rejections of Kantian critique, but I was also attentive to the way in which Hegel and Heidegger, long before Badiou and Meillassoux, had put forward serious challenges to the framework of Kant's transcendental philosophy. And I came to formulate the problem for my own purposes in this way. So I'll just work through 3 steps here of how I thought about this problem. So part of the project of Kant's critical philosophy was to displace the opposition of rationalism and empiricism. That is, the priority of either reason or experience in the production of knowledge. And he tried to do that through a theory of transcendental conditions of any possible experience, and also a theory of the limits of pure reason. And second, any critique of Kant's transcendental grounding of knowledge thus reopens the question of the relation between rationalism and empiricism. That is, the question of how the claims of reason and experience might amplify or cancel or undergird one another. And third, this methodological question bears upon the relationship between critique and speculation. Is it possible to think a dialectical relation of rationalism and empiricism, whereby reason and experience qualify, constrain, and push beyond one another, without that relationship being grounded in transcendental conditions of subjective cognition? And if so, would this amount to a form of speculation accountable to critique, yet also not subsumed or prohibited by it? Would it amount to a form of critique that proceeds without the security of grounds established once and for all, open to historical transformation and revision, precisely because it is also open to claims about the absolute? And if so, how are we to understand the epistemological criteria of that kind of relation between speculation and critique? So these are the major questions of the book. These are the questions the book sets out to explore, taking them up as they pertain to philosophy, to science, to art in one case, and to politics. And I try to think through the relationships between these different fields. So I define my major terms as follows. By rationalist, I mean a philosophical orientation that deploys the power of reason to push beyond the limits of experience by exploring what has to be thought according to the order and consistency of ideas. So Spinoza's Ethics, or Badiou's Being an Event, would be exemplary works of rationalist philosophy in this respect. By empiricist, I mean a philosophical orientation claiming the genesis of ideas and experience and grounding the determination of what is the case on the consistency of thinking with experiential fact. So Hume's claim that all ideas have their origin in impressions is exemplary of empiricism in this respect. So the major elements of these definitions are the alignment of rationalism with what has to be thought and of empiricism with what is the case. And these formulae repeat as sort of motifs throughout the book. But these definitions immediately raise some questions. What are the limits of experiential fact? Is what happens in thought itself a form of experience? Does the exploration of the order and consistency of ideas itself yield experiential facts? And are there forms of experience that cannot be understood through knowledge gleaned from experience, so the event or the encounter? What I call rationalist empiricism denotes, on the one hand, a methodological attunement toward the experience of thinking as included within the field of what happens, and on the other hand, an attunement to the power of thought to push the field of facts beyond the presumed synthesis of the past with the future by referring what happens to what has to be thought rather than to the succession of experience. Chapters in the book on Hegel's Science of Logic and on Badiou's Being an Event offer key examples of these two aspects or poles of rationalist empiricism. So first, Hegel's critique of Kant is that while Kant deduces categories that structure our cognitive determination of possible experience, Kant fails to interrogate what they are in themselves, how they are determined and related to one another apart from their abstract relation to the I. That's what Hegel says in his introduction to the Science of Logic. So this is Hegel's critique of the transcendental framing of Kantian critique. In its place, Hegel proposes what he calls a true critique and what I theorize as an immanent critique of the forms of cognition as they unfold in the process of thinking. That is, Hegel submits the experience of thought to an immanent critique of its determinations. The movements of the dialectic, differentiation, negation, sublation, unfold what has to be said of what happens in thought, as thought undergoes the experience of its taking place and thinks through the logical necessities that it encounters. The movement of the dialectic is, on my account, a form of rationalist empiricism. Hegel insists that the logic is concerned solely with the content of pure thinking, but he also insists that his investigation does not address the determinations of thought according to the abstract form of the a priori as contrasted with the a posteriori, but in themselves according to their particular content. So that is, the movement of thinking is encountered as it is experienced rather than postulated a priori. And the experience of thinking is exposed to the necessary determinations of its own content as it differentiates, negates, and preserves the results of its negations. It's this experience of thinking, what Hegel calls Erfahrung, by which Hegel displaces transcendental critique through speculative critique, coordinating the dialectical relation of reason and experience. So Hegel's dialectic exemplifies the exploration of pure thinking as an experiential field. Badiou's theory of the event, on the other hand, deals with eruptions within the field of experience that cannot be referred to past experience, such that what happens within the field opened by the event has to be treated as new. Anything encountered in that field has to be evaluated according to whether or not it belongs to the event, yes or no, and thus whether in the future anterior it will have belonged to the construction of a new truth. The theory of the event involves a shuttling back and forth between the rational and the empirical, such that every term encountered in the trajectory of the subject is submitted to the formal rule of a binary decision, exclusion or inclusion, whose only proper referent is what will be rather than what has been before. Through the event, the rational enters into the field of the empirical and pushes it forward into the production of the future rather than a synthesis with the past. What Badiou calls the subject becomes the scission of the future from the past. Thus, in the book, I have a chapter theorizing Badiou's theory of the event as consonant with Hume's problem of induction. That is, the event opens a sequence of experience for which custom or habit is not the great guide. The event makes the future the sufficient reason for action within the present, such that rational commitment to a regulative idea, rather than habit, comes to coordinate experience. So these are two different examples of rationalist empiricism at work in the book and latent, I think, within the philosophical tradition. But Louis Althusser had also used the term rationalist empiricism in a 1966 lecture in quite a different sense. So there he used it to refer to the French tradition of epistemology of science that I mentioned earlier. Althusser would have had in mind the work of Gaston Bachelard, who claimed that empiricism and rationalism are bound in scientific thought by a strange bond, as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain. That becomes the epigraph to my book. Bachelard is normally thought of as a rationalist philosopher of science, but he always insisted on the complementarity of rationalism and empiricism. The one triumphs by assenting to the other, he writes. I'll go on quoting, empiricism needs to be understood, rationalism needs to be applied. An empiricism without clear, coordinated deductive laws can neither be thought nor taught. A rationalism without palpable proofs and without application to immediate reality cannot fully convince. The value of an empirical law is proved by making it the basis for a chain of reasoning. A chain of reasoning becomes legitimate by making it the basis of an experiment. That's Bachelard. Bachelard argues that the philosophy of science too often, quote, remains corralled in the two extremes of knowledge. It stresses first the a priori and then the a posteriori, misrecognizing the transmutation of epistemological values which contemporary scientific thought ceaselessly executes between the a priori and the a posteriori, between experimental and rational values. So just as Hegel does in the Science of Logic, Bachelard rejects the opposition of the a priori and the a posteriori, emphasizing the dialectical transmutation of rationalist and empiricist values. I try to model this approach to the philosophy of science through a chapter on the recent redefinition of the kilogram unit. Whereas the kilogram had been defined since the 1790s by the mass of a physical object stored in a vault in Sèvres, France, the value of the unit has now been redefined with reference to the value of the Planck constant, so to the number, the Planck constant, the minimal unit of electromagnetic energy. This redefinition correlates mass to energy, and it was completed in 2018, it involved a complex process of measuring the Planck constant itself against the mass of a kilogram reference object. What I try to show in this chapter is that such practices, which are at the reflexive limits of scientific knowledge, the measuring of metrical units themselves, these practices depend precisely upon the dialectic of experiment and formalization theorized by Bachelard. Indeed, the redefinition of the kilogram and also of the entire system of metrical units on a similar basis, which this redefinition concluded, it exemplifies a historical dialectic, whereby the standards of measurement, which enabled advances in scientific experiment and physical theory, themselves come to be redefined through the very results of those advances. So in this case, the equations of relativity theory and quantum mechanics that allow us to correlate mass and energy. So science perpetually regrounds the very basis of its practices through an ungrounded dialectic of the rational and the empirical, coordinating systems of equations and physical apparatuses used in experiments. It's exactly this dialectical transmutation of epistemological poles that constitutes the epistemology of science. The capacity to test formalizations against experiments and to test experiments against formalizations, to hold them accountable to those formalizations. Moreover, I try to show in this chapter that the redefinition of the kilogram can be approached philosophically through Hegel's theory of measure. For Hegel, measure is the determinate synthesis of quantitative and qualitative properties that makes something what it is. And thus he calls it the concrete truth of being. I try to show that measurement, the scientific practice of measurement, relies upon the capacity to determine the measure of metrical units themselves through recursive historical practices of epistemological regrounding that are at once open to transformation and rigorously coherent. So through this chapter on the kilogram, and through my discussion of French epistemology of science in the introduction to the book, I defend Quentin Meillassoux' Cartesian thesis that, quote, all those aspects of an object that can be formulated in mathematical terms can be meaningfully conceived as properties of the object in itself. But I also grapple with the complexity of this claim in relation to the constitutive uncertainty of scientific measurement and also the revisability of scientific knowledge. So with these in mind, I try to show that it's true that the referent of scientific knowledge is the properties of the in itself. So for example, the numerical value of the Planck constant, while the historical methodological dialectic of the rational and the empirical, the movement between formalization and experiment, keeps the determination of such reference open to revision. This is basically a structural realist position on the coherence of what I would call provisional objectivity. The referent of revisable determinations is external to the determinations themselves, while these determinations constitute revisable knowledge of those referents. Through an engagement with the digital photography of Montreal artist Nicolas Bayer, I also try to show that digitization enables us to index the properties of objects in themselves. For example, Bayer produces a digital model of a meteorite, which I once held in my hand and which now no longer exists since he melted it down into graphite. But taking this meteorite, he maps the structure of the object through 3D scanning, and then he reconstructs the object at a far larger scale through stereolithography, 3D printing, as a sculpture which retains the physical form of the meteorite. So the structure of the object is retained as it passes through mineral, digital, and sculptural instantiations, while the matter of the object is transformed in the process. Bayer's artistic practice shows that while the indexical function of photography has been viewed as compromised by digital technology, as a perennial concern in media theory since the advent of digital photography, such technology in fact enables an indexical exactitude which radically exceeds that of analog photography. such that it is possible to reproduce the properties of an object through different material inscriptions of its form. Bayer's experimental practice amounts to a demonstration that the mathematical formalization of physical properties determines and sustains their structure in a manner exceeding phenomenological synthesis. That mathematization goes beyond what we see and touch and feel in the presence of an object by sustaining its structure across differential phenomenal presentations. In this chapter on Bayer, I try to coordinate this understanding of structural indexicality also with Alfred North Whitehead's theory of prehensions as determinations of objects, and also with Bernard Stiegler's thinking of the relation between technology, inscription, and thought. I also engage with Meillassoux' claim in After Finitude, now in a different context, in chapter 4 of the book, that speculative philosophy is also concerned with a different level at which we think the in itself. That is, with the ontological question of being qua being, being per se. Going beyond the scope of After Finitude, in this chapter, I reconstruct Meillassoux' thinking of absolute contingency, the necessary contingency of being itself, through the far more detailed and precise exposition of his philosophy that's available in his doctoral dissertation, which was filed in 1997. And I've also, if you're interested, I've also translated a section of the dissertation that bears most directly upon some of the questions that I'm discussing here. What I try to show is that the two senses of the in itself in Meillassoux' work, so one, which refers to the properties of objects in themselves, and two, a sense which refers to the necessity of contingency as the modality of being in itself. These two senses correspond to the structure of what Heidegger calls the ontological difference. That is, beings are contingent, while being is necessarily contingent. This is Meillassoux' argument, and it's the way that he works through the ontological difference. So contingency is ontic. It pertains to beings. The necessity of contingency is ontological, pertains to being qua being. It is necessarily the case, this is Meillassoux, that any being may be otherwise than it is. And indeed, that the very laws through which we understand relations among beings may be otherwise than they are, that they can change. What's at issue here, and this is the way that the problem is framed in the dissertation, which I think is extremely compelling. What's at issue here is the philosophical concept of becoming. So the laws of nature can be thought of as the laws of becoming. But the question is there a becoming of laws? The precise question is whether becoming is only governed by laws, or whether becoming is itself in excess of laws, such that the becoming of laws is included in its concept. Meillassoux' complex argument for the absolute status of contingency, the necessity of contingency as the modality of being qua being, is also an argument for the absolute status of becoming, that the laws of becoming are subject to a becoming of laws. And this ontological sense of becoming, which Meillassoux calls absolute contingency, can only be thought by philosophy, not by science. So science studies the ontic predicates of objects and relations, the properties of things in themselves. But speculative philosophy goes beyond the ontic remit of science to think the ontological, the necessity of contingency as the very concept of being in itself. This argument and these two senses of the in itself thus give us a way of understanding the relationship between science and philosophy. Philosophy must be consistent with science. So I insist on this point. Speculative thought cannot invalidate the results of scientific knowledge. However, scientific knowledge can also not invalidate the speculative scope of philosophical thinking, which goes beyond the ontic to think the ontological, to which science has no access at all. On this point, Meillassoux' relation to Badiou is crucial. Badiou mobilizes the results of transfinite set theory to invalidate the alignment of the concept of the infinite with the concept of the whole. As Meillassoux shows, this also invalidates the application of the calculus of probabilities to a total set of cases, to the whole, that is, to the being of beings. So the ontic is finite, beings are finite, and they are contingent. But the necessity of contingency is the concept of being as unforeclosably infinite, as in excess of any totality of cases to which probabilistic reasoning may be applied. The thinking of absolute contingency may not be foreclosed by the observable stability of the laws of nature, an observable stability which has in fact come into being. For Meillassoux, insofar as it thinks ontologically, speculative philosophy goes beyond the laws of becoming to think the becoming of laws, which itself may not be thought as governed by those laws which become. So the philosophy of science theorizes the ontic operations of scientific practice, while the philosophy of being, that is ontology, reasons about the only necessity in excess of empirical facts, the necessity of contingency. But I don't thereby mean to argue that science is empirical while philosophy is rational. Rather, as I have argued in this paper, science relies upon a dialectic of its rational and empirical dimensions, while philosophy also theorizes scientific knowledge, as well as the phenomenological appearing of objects, as well as encounters in the case of Badiou, which exceed the regularity of empirical experience. So what I'm saying is the purview of philosophy is both ontic and ontological. But the domain of the ontological is that of reason, what is necessarily the case. This is a speculative dimension of philosophy that must go beyond possible experience, and Hegel had already argued as much in The Science of Logic. So the task of chapter 4 of my book is to show that the difference between speculative thought in Hegel and Meillassoux is thus the difference between speculative idealism and speculative materialism. And it's interesting that in Meillassoux' dissertation, the primary interlocutor is not Kant, but Hegel. It's really his relation to Hegel, which he's concerned with. And his advisor, Bernard Bourgeois, is the preeminent French Hegelian. So for Hegel, thought itself is the absolute, that which we cannot think outside of. For Meillassoux, the necessity of contingency demands that thought itself be considered as contingent. And that is precisely what we think when we think the absolute scope of contingency, that thought itself is finite. Thought is contingent. What thought thinks, when it thinks ontologically, is the necessity of contingency. And speculative materialism thus consists, Meillassoux' program of speculative materialism, consists in an unbinding of thought and being, precisely through the capacity of thought to think being in itself, to think that thought itself is necessarily contingent. So in a way, my book is motivated by this distinction between Hegel and Meillassoux, but as I hope to have made clear, its concerns also go far beyond clarifying the implications of Meillassoux' work. Instead, as I am to demonstrate, his work belongs to a far broader tradition of rationalist empiricism that includes Hegel himself, that includes the French epistemology of science, that includes Badiou's political theory of the event, and that might be mobilized toward an understanding of contemporary practices in science and in art. And indeed, I argue that Marx as well should be understood as a rationalist empiricist. So this is the final chapter of the book. In order for that to make sense, one has only to recognize the different levels of reflection upon which scientific, epistemological, ontological, and political theory are operating. Marx is perhaps the modern thinker whose work requires a rigorous coordination of the rational and the empirical, of historical fact and analytical structure, of rational concepts and empirical phenomena. It's because Marx develops a systematic articulation of conceptual relationships that he's able to understand the structure of capitalism, the substance of value, and the mechanisms of accumulation. Yet it is only in and through his historical research that Marx is able to articulate that conceptual system. And this is the import of the structure of Das Kapital itself, with its alternation between historical and conceptual chapters. So in my chapter on Marx, I argue that the concept of separation, the German Scheidung, is the key to grasping his rationalist empiricism. It's in the central historical chapters of Capital that Marx describes the division of labor as a process of separation, a Scheidungsprozess, wherein intellectual and manual labor are separated along with different elements of the process of production. This process of separation, writes Marx, starts in simple cooperation, where the capitalist represents to the individual workers the unity and the will of the whole body of social labor. It is developed in manufacture, which mutilates the worker, turning him into a fragment of himself. And it's completed in large-scale industry, which makes science a potentiality for production, which is distinct from labor and presses it into the service of capital. Now, I think the distinction between the concept of separation mobilized here by Marx and the concept of alienation allows us to formulate the stakes of what Althusser calls Marx's epistemological break. That is, the development of his mature theoretical apparatus and the displacement of earlier ideological elements of his theory. Whereas alienation as a concept involves a logic of exteriorization, entauserung. Separation occurs between what is separated, not necessarily from an inside to an outside. Thus, in his mature theory, Marx is able to reconstruct what had once gone by the name of alienation, and sometimes still does, as a process of separation. And this allows new conceptual extensions and syntheses. Not only the division of labor, but also primitive accumulation is described as a process of separation. And so is the gradual distinction between the nominal content and the real content of the money form. Indeed, Marx states that, quote, the process of separation thus includes the whole developmental history of modern bourgeois society. Now, interestingly, that's not in the third edition of Capital, but it is in the 1867 and 1872 editions. So it's not translated in the Penguin translation that everybody uses. The stakes of this terminology become clear if we consider Marx's striking claim that, quote, the division of labor converts the product of labor into a commodity and thereby makes necessary its conversion into money. The division of labor does that. On this basis, I argue that the process of separation, with its crux in the division of labor, is the very ground of value itself. Separation is, I think, the fundamental concept in Das Kapital, although Marx hardly stresses this point, insofar as it enables us to grasp the link between the labor process and the valorization process, as well as between historical and conceptual dimensions of Marx's theory. The concept of separation is located at the crux of the rationalist and empiricist dimensions of Marx's work, which is why the historical chapters on the division of labor constitute the major part of the section of the book which is dedicated to defining the concept of relative surplus value, which is itself one of Marx's most theoretically abstract and systematically important concepts. So the historical chapters are at the heart of that conceptual determination through the definition of the division of labor as a Scheidungsprozess. So across all these different, and here I'm close to wrapping up, across all these different aspects of my book, as well as chapters on Descartes and Hume, on Plato's Timaeus, and on the work of the French group Théorie Communiste, and I don't have time to talk about all these, but I'm happy to in the Q&A. I try to offer a unified framework for understanding the dialectical relation of reason and experience in philosophy, science, art, and political theory. I aim to show that the same dialectic is active in each of these fields at different levels of reflection and at different levels of the relation between theory and practice. The overall goal of the book is to show that it's possible to sustain a productive relationship between speculation and critique rather than demanding the cancellation of one by the other. And what makes that possible is this relay between the rational and the empirical that I pursue. By displacing Kant's transcendental grounding of critique, one thereby reopens the question of the relation between rationalism and empiricism. And it's precisely that relation that allows critique to function without a transcendentally secure ground, and that allows speculation to go beyond possible experience while respecting and also theorizing the results of scientific knowledge. Finally, I want to say that my methodological perspective also implies a certain way of understanding the history of philosophy. That history, I would argue, is both irreversible and open. Kantian critique displaces the division of rationalism and empiricism as distinct and competing philosophical positions or methods. In order to criticize Kant, Hegel has to go through transcendental philosophy and submit it to an immanent critique, which is the science of logic. And I think that after Hegel, we can't go back to Kant's manner of grounding critique. Hegel navigates the experience of what happens in thought through a rational interrogation of what has to be said, a dialectical exploration of the experience and rationality of thinking. Marx takes up this kind of movement at the level of the relation between history and theory, fact and concept, in order to produce a systematic understanding of the structure of capitalism. Bachelard grapples with the problems of scientific epistemology in a post-Kantian way by giving up transcendental grounding in favor of a historical dialectic of experiment and formalization. Badiou thinks the opening of experience to what cannot be synthesized with past experience, and therefore has to be forced through forms of rational commitment to the future anterior. And Meillassoux takes up Badiou's ontological thinking of the transfinite to reopen Hume's problem of induction. So that is to say, Hume's major critical argument, synthesizing key elements of Cartesian and Humean rationalist and empiricist approaches to the relation between speculation and critique. So finally, my hope is that rationalist empiricism might open new ways of thinking about that relation between speculation and critique, so as to free us from a superficial and unproductive opposition of speculative and critical imperatives. Thanks, everyone.
I've unmuted myself, so I'm the only person you can hear clapping, but I think everybody's clapping. I'm sure everybody is. Well, that was a really tremendous précis of the book, Nathan. Of course, it's so rich and it covers so much ground that you had to leave out like Plato and Hume, Descartes. Read the book if you want to find out. But that was extremely helpful, and I'm sure Manish will have many questions, and as will others. So I'll hand it over to Manish, who can unmute himself, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions, actually, after a brief preamble. First of all, I want to say congratulations to Nathan on the publication of Rationalist Empiricism. Thank you also for the opportunity to serve as a respondent during this event. I was delighted to revisit your remarkable book, and I'm honored and humbled to have the occasion to pose some questions that came to me upon first reading, but subsequent reading has allowed me to concretize. Like Stephen, I should say, as Stephen quite eloquently put it, I strive to become a reader fully equipped to appreciate its rigorous and precise argumentation, its magisterial command of the philosophical tradition, and its truly original contribution to continental thought. So congratulations again, Nathan. A major accomplishment of your book is its generation of an alternate modality of critique inspired, as your first footnote attests, by the speculative excesses of certain trends in continental thought eager to access a real that transcends subjective correlation. Yet in their zeal to encounter a, quote, great outdoors not correlated to human thought, these thinkers ignore the crucial delimitations that critical philosophy can and should impose upon their audacious speculative ventures. At the same time, it is the objective of rationalist empiricism to open thought to a radical exteriority ungrounded by transcendental conditions of possible experience. So you at once preserve Kant's critical imperative, but displace its operation, as your précis made so clear. According to your work, it is through the mesh provided by techniques and rational formalization that we can filter out subjective determinations and encounter a provisional objectivity, always open to revision, but not correlated to a transcendental unity of apperception. Indeed, it is by emphasizing the separation and priority of objectivity over and against the subject that rationalist empiricism establishes its materialist and Althusserian credentials. Thus, your analysis allows us to conceive the manner with which reason, or the necessity of what has to be thought, may be coordinated with experience or the contingency of the given of what happens, of what is the case. This, as I understand it, is the crux of the problematic of speculative critique. So let me turn now to my first question. The first concerns the operation of this coordination between reason and experience. And there are a number of ways that you describe this coordination: relational disjunction, dialectic, mediation, interruption, difference, strikingly, structure, and perhaps most memorably by means of Bachelard's formulation, this strange bond as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain, this strange bond. This terminological ramification is very interesting to me as I think about the simultaneous dehiscence and conjunction of reason and experience. So my question is the following: is the bond, this strange and strong bond between the necessity of reason and the contingency of experience, itself a necessary or a contingent relation? And I'm inspired to pose this question by contemplating, the one condition of thought from Badiou that is not directly imported into your book. There is science, politics, and art, of course, but there's also the amatory condition for Badiou, love, which emerges from Badiou's contemplation of the Lacanian apotheme: the sexual relation does not exist. The relation does not exist. I recall here your precise and evocative description of philosophical topology at the beginning of your chapter on absent blue wax. Quote, "Philosophical communication suggests a strange topology wherein the exteriority of thought, the possibility that we may think one philosopher with another, is encountered within the deepest recesses of systems that would seem to shelter the specificity of their concepts from one another," end quote. So is the curvature of philosophical topology such that rationalism and empiricism are inevitably drawn to their mutual exteriority, to what they would otherwise exclude?
That's very interesting. So first of all, thanks so much, Manish, for being a respondent. Manish read my entire book in manuscript, and I think he was one of the first people to do so, which I greatly appreciated. And had some extremely helpful comments on the book before it was published. So I take it there are sort of two questions there. Let me begin with this question about the Bachelard's curious formulation. Rationalism and empiricism are joined by a strange bond as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain. And you asked, is this bond between reason and experience, rationalism and empiricism, contingent or necessary? And I came to approach Bachelard's formulation as a kind of riddle, which I then tried to answer in the conclusion to the book. That is to say, what does it mean, this strange bond which is as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain? And so I asked myself, well, what is it that unites pleasure and pain? And the answer to the question that I gave in the conclusion of the book, in engaging a little bit with Michel Henry, positively but also critically, was that it's life, actually. Life itself is the bond between pleasure and pain. Life is the condition of possibility for any, for the sensation, for the receptivity of pleasure or pain. And so then I asked myself, okay, well, if rationalism and empiricism are joined by a bond as strong as that, which joins pleasure and pain, life, then what is that other bond? And the answer that I gave, this might seem a little bit strange, but actually it's in some ways at the core of the book. The answer that I gave was that it's technics. It's technology in a sense that would include writing, in fact, any kind of inscription. That joins rationalism and empiricism in the way that life joins pleasure and pain. And this is a bond that's as strong as life as the bond of pleasure and pain, but also different than it and exteriorizing of it, crucially. So the key thing here would be, for example, Bernard Stiegler's argument, which I take very seriously. Description is itself coeval with the very capacity to think. And so thought is already, and this would also be a critique of the transcendental, which in some ways is implied in Husserl, and which is taken up in Derrida's introduction to Husserl's book on the origins of geometry, that technics, that writing, that inscription already exteriorizes thought in the very advent of thought, in the first instance, that thought is exterior to the interiority of the subject because it is coeval with the advent of writing, with inscription. And Stiegler has a complicated argument about that that I take up to some degree in the chapter on Nicolas Bayer. But what I think is important about this is that it gives us a way of thinking about a sort of critique of the transcendental enabled by the thinking of inscription. And in the book on one page, I don't have a slide, but I'll maybe try to write it up just in the chat bar. I offer a sort of diagram of the relation between rationalism and empiricism that goes like this, if I can do this. So it's, if we put over here, rationalism, formalization, and then let's do it like this, inscription. And then, so that's my little formula. So we move from rationalism on the one hand and empiricism on the other hand to formalization, mathematical formalization, from rationalism to experiment from empiricism. So for example, apparatuses, techniques, etc. And these are joined at the crux of inscription, formalization and experiment. And so, you know, I argue that writing inscription already throws thought outside of itself in the first instance. This is a kind of Stieglerian, Heideggerian way of thinking about, and indeed Derridian way of thinking about the relation between thought and exteriority as opened by technics. And that's why life in the advent of thinking, coeval with the advent of writing, is forced outside of itself. It can't merely dwell within the immanence of its receptivity, of its auto-affection, as Michel Henry argues. And so this exteriorizing force is a critique of the transcendental. And then the question becomes, how does one coordinate that kind of bond of inscription, writing at the very crux of thinking between the reason and experience? And so the theory of the philosophy of science that I offer, that it's formalization and experiment which have to be coordinated in the sort of recursive historical process of scientific practice and formalization, allows us to think that exteriority of thought to life, to phenomena, in fact. And so instruments and inscriptions and formalizations become what I call the sieve of the transcendental subject. They filter out our conditions of subjective phenomenal receptivity through technologies that have very different conditions of receptivity, and through formalizations that can be gleaned from those modes of technical receptivity. Your other question was about this, the topology of the history of philosophy, basically. That is to say, the strange topology of the interaction of philosophical systems. And what I had in mind here, so this is the way that I introduced this chapter on the philosophical exceptions in Descartes and Hume. And in that chapter, the first chapter of the book, I try to show that there is like a key rationalist exception in Hume and a key empiricist exception in Descartes. And I try to think the space then of extra systemic exteriority that those kinds of exceptions inhabit. And the problem there, I think that raises, thinking about philosophy in a kind of topological sense like that, is that in a way, in order to constitute themselves, philosophical systems have to kind of close in on themselves. If philosophy, as Deleuze says, involves the construction of concepts, the way those concepts are constructed is through the integral relation, the systematic relation between them, such that they refer to other concepts in the system and hold themselves up through that integral coherence, as Marx's Capital does in one sense, or as Hegel's logic does. And that puts us in a strange position of readers of philosophy, because when we enter into the understanding of, when we try to understand a philosophical system, we have to go all the way. Right? We have to enter into that philosophical system. And so that, how then does it communicate with other philosophical systems? What is it? What's the compossibility of different philosophical systems? How do we move from one to the other when understanding means something fundamentally different in Kant than it might in a different philosopher, for example? And so I think the key thing here is to establish a way to sort of like think the common ground of philosophical systems precisely in one sense through the exceptions that they produce, which then can themselves be coordinated amongst themselves, or to try to set up a methodological way of traversing different philosophical systems, which is what I try to do. So obviously Marx and Meillassoux, or Bachelard and Marx, or Bachelard and Plato are, fundamentally different kinds of thinkers with very, very different concerns, and one should not try to like splice them together. At the same time, methodologically, there may be ways of thinking about the relation between experience and reason, rationalism and empiricism, that traverse these different philosophical systems, or we can follow the different ways in which they operate within those philosophical systems. So what I'm trying to do in the book in a certain way is open up a certain methodological way. It's not like I don't want to promulgate some sort of methodological school or anything like that. It's just a way of thinking about and reading philosophy, and coordinating its different activities insofar as they bear upon this relation between the discrepancy in the relation between reason and experience that on the one hand Kant tried to displace, and that he also like theorized on new grounds. And we have to reopen that question if we criticize Kant. So I hope I got to those two elements of your question.
Absolutely. Thanks for that very rich response, Nathan. I'll just pose one more question, if that's okay. And it has to do with your assessment of Badiou as kind of as a rationalist and an empiricist, and the way that he brings these methodological, epistemological, and ontological poles together. So I ask this question because of the emphasis you place throughout your book on mathematical formalization and logical chains of entailment, deduction, etc. Now, arguably, Badiou is the continental thinker who has gone farthest towards mathematically formalizing philosophy itself by means of an ontology grounded in post-Kantorian set theory. And yet, I'm very curious about how your systematic exposition of rationalist empiricism can absorb Badiou's culminating proof in being an event, right, which ontologizes the mathematical discovery of Paul Cohen, right? And in Badiou's translation of this discovery, right, the laws of being themselves, the axioms of set theory, cannot decide on the quantitative measure of statist excess over the original situation if the latter's elements are denumerable. The continuum hypothesis is undecidable by the axioms of set theory alone, which for Badiou are the laws of being. They govern being. For Badiou, therefore, it's only a subject who can decide on the undecidability of the errancy of statist excess. So Badiou's mathematical formalization of ontology ultimately gives rise to, opens a space for, the subject. The being of the subject is thus a symptom of being. Badiou moves from the extreme of mathematical formalization to the necessary emergence of the subject. Rationalist empiricism seems to do the opposite. It deploys mathematical formalization to filter out the contingencies of subjective determination. Is this a misapprehension of the tension between the two systems, or is this tension productive, or is it not actually a tension at all?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think, throughout all the different kinds of arguments that I make in the book, it's extremely important, I think, for me to try to specify these different levels of reflection that they're operating on. So in Badiou, for example, in Badiou, the theory of being qua being is not really philosophical at all, it's mathematical. He says ontology is mathematics, mathematics is ontology. So he hands over the theory of being to mathematics, and then he sort of like, in a sort of meta-ontological way, tries to theorize what mathematics tells us about being. And that's, because being is inconsistent multiplicity in Badiou, then it's, in his opinion, the formalizations of set theory that enable us to think in a way which is adequate to the inconsistency of the multiple. But so mathematics is the theory of being, whereas philosophy in Badiou is crucially the theory of the subject, not the theory of being. And so it's the theory of the subject that is taken up at the level of philosophical reflection as that which is proper, let's say, to philosophy. That is to say, philosophy coordinates the thinking of the advent of subjects in the fields of science, politics, love, and art. And so, but the advent of the subject itself is practical. So no advent of any subject ever is necessary historically. None of us are subjects until we take up, in Badiou's theory, what he calls fidelity to an event in the production of a truth. And so in that sense, there's a sort of, let's say, primacy of practice in the advent of subjects, which then has to be theorized by philosophy. And what's interesting there is that, okay, a subject decides on the exception that an event is. It's not, an event can happen, the French Revolution, let's say, and someone like Francois Furet, the reactionary French historian, can simply say the French Revolution never happened, no such thing exists. Whatever they called the French Revolution is just a figment of the imagination, basically. But for the subjects of that sequence who call it the revolution, right? They, as Badiou says, they add that name, to the sequence which is unfolding, and they configure their activities in consequence with, let's say, the primacy of that name as it now orders the situation. And they have to decide, should this or should this not belong to the revolution? Now, so the subjects, what's interesting is that, knowing Badiou's theory of the subject will not really help you act in a political sequence. In fact, it will probably be a great distraction. So Badiou is not trying to give you a theory that will help you know how to act in a political sequence. Precisely, you have to take up the criteria of every political sequence, which might be an event, according to its own grounds, according to its own criteria, which are radically new. But he tries to tell us what subjects are doing when they do that. The eruption of an event is contingent. The fidelity of a subject to an event, in a sense, is contingent. It's something the subject decides and holds oneself to. And it's oriented toward the production of something in the future anterior, what will have been the case if we do construct the consequences of this event. And so when the subject does that, and I have this little diagram in my book, there's a kind of shuttling between the poles of the rational and the empirical, because the subject encounters new elements in the situation and then has to decide on what to do with them, whether they belong properly to the sequence that's unfolding or not. And I try to exemplify this, but I give a sort of concrete example, which is Occupy Oakland, the sequence that unfolded in 2011, 2012 in Oakland. And I try to give some examples of the importance of names, the importance of these kinds of decisions on actions in that sequence. But nothing necessitates the emergence of a subject. The other thing is that, so you mentioned this finally, this relationship of mathematical formalization to experience, but that pertains to science. So that's a different level of reflection, to put it that way. That's an argument about how rationalist empiricism is operating in the historical dialectic of scientific practice, whereas this other dimension of it is specific to Badiou's theory of the event. And so this is what I sort of try to show. There are all these different ways in which this kind of dialectic of reason and experience might work out in the way that I try to theorize it: ungrounded, recursive, self-checking and propelling, etc. And I try to take that up on these very different grounds. So the argument is not that, that they're all the same, or that they can be considered within the same terms. Okay, so thanks so much, Manish. I guess I open it up.
Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, I really appreciate those, extremely acute questions. So I guess we can up to others when we can, we have about 50 minutes left, and of course anyone can leave whenever you might like, but I'm happy to talk as long as people want to.
If folks want to do the raise hand function, or just, you can also just put your hand up.
But you could write in the chat bar or raise
Write in the chat bar question. Yeah, there's lots of ways. I'll be keeping an eye on that.
Yeah, Joshua.
Yeah, this is going to be a kind of stupid person question, so forgive me. I guess to phrase it in broadest terms, what isn't rationalist empiricism? And what I mean is, like, if, you know, this is a reading strategy and there's a way in which we can think about these different philosophies which toggle between reason and experience, what, you know, prevents something as a philosophy from becoming exemplary of that? Or is it the case that it's just operative all of the time, which I don't think is true and exactly what you're not saying. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say first and foremost, transcendental philosophy is not rationalist empiricism. Why? Because it tries to give a synthetic ground of conditions of all possible experience in the structure of subjective cognition. And what that does in the way that I view it is precisely that it, let's put it this way, it synthesizes too much. It doesn't allow, first of all, in order for there to be, this would be the argument, in order for there to be something like rationalist empiricism, there has to be a disjunction between reason and experience, whereby they can encounter one another, propel one another forward or further, or critique one another. They can't have, as it were, the same ground. Reason and experience, in fact, are distinct. You know, as obviously Kant himself thinks about the different purview of reason and understanding, of ideas and concepts. But the ground of the transcendental displaces this dialectical relationship of negation, in fact, between reason and experience, which is crucial to what I'm trying to think about. And that's why Hegel is so important to this project, that it's Hegel who says, you know, well, we need to give an immanent critique, a true critique of the forms of thought as they appear in the experience of thinking. And how does he do that? By distinction, by negation, and by preserving what is negated as determinate content. And that form of immanent critique, then, I think, opens up a new way of thinking about the relation between speculation and critique, which is only grounded by the very experience of thinking as it encounters its own demands. And that's the kind of radical ungroundedness of Hegelian critique. And I think he's right. You know, so when people respond to let's say, a non-transcendental condition by critiquing it on the grounds of Kantian transcendental philosophy, which I have, by the way, absolutely immense respect for, as you know, and take extremely seriously. But nevertheless, the question has to be, well, what does the Kantian do with the Hegelian critique of Kant? You know, because sometimes Kantians will argue as if it's, you know, 1790, and that's not the case. Or they'll argue as if Alain Badiou or Quentin Meillassoux are the first philosophers to criticize Kant, which is also not the case. You know, and so we have to take seriously the intervention, which in my opinion is irreversible in the history of philosophy, of the critique of Hegel of Kant by Hegel, and also of Heidegger, of Kant by Heidegger, who shows that the transcendental unity of apperception of the I cannot be preserved from the exteriorizing force of temporalization. You know, that's his reading in the Kant book of the transcendental deduction. And I also accept that critique of Kant. And so I take these two critiques of Kant very seriously, you know? So I think, first of all, transcendental philosophy is. The other thing that isn't, I would say, rationalist empiricism is any, so I don't want to get into a long discussion of object-oriented ontology, but it is something that I criticize very briefly just in the very first paragraph of the book. So there you have a speculative system which, let's say, doesn't even obey the demands of reason. Right? It doesn't force itself to encounter and to respect the coherence of what has to be thought in the interrelationship of philosophical concepts. And so I can't demonstrate that right now, but I've tried to elsewhere. And so it tries to be a form of speculative philosophy that doesn't even obey the demands of reason, right? Let alone the relationship, like dialectically, of reason and experience at different levels of reflection. So I would say, rationalist dogmatism, or a vulgar materialism that also tries to reduce philosophical reasoning just to the pragmatic evidence of facts, that says philosophical truth is reducible to the information provided us by science. So no, actually, philosophy is different than science insofar as it has to think ontologically and go beyond facts. And it's reason that allows us to do that. But there has to be, a kind of coordination of reason and experience and a respect for the facts given to us by science at the same time as one doesn't allow philosophical speculation to be sort of like canceled or prohibited by them.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joshua. Other questions? Yes, Peter. Wonderful.
While other people think, and while I think, because I'm sort of thinking on my feet here, there's a lot to digest in what you said. And first of all, thank you so much for it. And it's kind of, I'm trying to remember, I first met you in 2004, I think it was. And there's parts of that early conversation that are kind of recurring, and I'm struck by the consistency of it and how you've taken this agenda and pushed it, so productively and so far. And it's really, it's great to have been part of that, feel like part of that conversation for a long time. So and still a very live one. And I basically have two questions, and they're sort of only half coherent, and they're both framed by a real appreciation of what I take to be your core move, which is this relating of these two, the empirical and the rational, which could so easily be divorced and have so often been divorced, and to do it particularly through motifs of separation and division. So I really like that idea. You're framing it nicely with the kilogram example, but also of separation in Marx as a way then of looking at the measure there of value, the measure of the, I've seen the way you would apply it to money as the form of value. I haven't read that chapter yet, but I think I can see how that would work. But I guess then my question is about where are the points where that relational move that you're making, or the dialectical relational move you're making, break down? Or are there points where they break down? And I have, I guess, two questions about that. One is the relation between the ontic and the ontological, and the other is between the theoretical and the practical. So first with the ontic ontological, I mean, either a la Heidegger, and through Heidegger into Stiegler, and you'd have, but I actually really want to ask about it via Badiou. But with the Heidegger, Derrida, Stiegler, you would have the question of time, doing some of the linking. And where, so you mentioned technology, techniques as the thing that links the rational and the empirical. Does that presuppose, though, a further link to time? And is there something primordial then, if you go down that path, about the status of time, which would then presume something about take you back into the loop with life, I think. But where does that, do you go back, if you follow that path, do you go back to something like some non-relational point of departure, like the appearing of being or something like that, or some initial move, But more interestingly for me, with Badiou, do you see is there a relationship between that ontological, as you know very well, the mathematical side of it, the purely mathematical side of it, and then the ontic dimension in Badiou? So which is this word that I think is not well ever described in Badiou, although maybe you would know better, of what he calls an étant, a being. And he talks about this in Logics of Worlds, but he doesn't really define it very clearly. So it's obvious what he means by being, pure being, as inconsistent multiplicity, as you say. And it's also clear what he means by objects, things that can be ordered in worlds. But the beings that are thus ordered, it's not so clear to me what that would be. And that would be the disconnect between numbers as numbers, pure forms of being, and then measures, numbers as deployed to measure something like a kilogram or a pound or a dollar or whatever unit of measure that's applied in some ontic situation. But in Badiou, is there a relation between those two things? Like, is there some kind of dialectic that would take you from the one to the other? Or is there in fact just a gap, which would mean that ultimately he's not really a dialectical thinker, and in that sense different from Hegel. So that's one cluster of questions. Sorry, this is taking so long. I'll wrap up the other one quickly, which is about the practical. And there again, do you need to make a choice between the primacy of practice or the primacy of theory? And I was a little bit struck by how, when you describe rationalism, it's broadly in terms of sequence of ideas and ways of thinking through, and the primacy of thinking in a sense. But you could argue that with, say, Kant, the primacy of rationalism is a practical primacy. It's a primacy of moral reasoning, of what you can do, displacing knowledge in favor of faith, or however he wants to put it. And there again, do you have to make a choice between, is your synthetic relational approach adequate to making the choice, which there might boil down to primacy of practice versus the primacy of theory? So, or in your terms, a choice between Kant's moral philosophy and, say, Hegel's speculative philosophy.
Thank you. So it's great to see you. It's great to get your questions, Peter. I don't mean to be too sappy, but I will, I'm afraid, and I know it will embarrass you, but I will take the occasion to thank Peter Hallward, who more than anyone else, I think, has been my mentor in philosophy. And if I hadn't met Peter, I would never have written this book. And it's Peter's example of philosophical rigor and commitment that really made me feel a sort of philosophical vocation as an English student, and that pushed me toward this project. So thank you for that. There are three questions there, I guess, one pertaining to time, one to Badiou's theory in particular, and one to this relation between theory and practice. Let me take them in reverse order. There is a primacy of practice, in my opinion. That's absolutely, that's the core of the difference. Well, maybe not. I was going to say between Marx and Hegel, but maybe it's true actually in a way of Hegel as well. But in my opinion, anyway, that's the core of a Marxist orientation toward politics. And in my chapter on Althusser and Théorie communiste, which I didn't get a chance to talk about in the introduction, that's very much at the center of the way that I think of the importance of Théorie communiste. That Théorie communiste speaks of the theorizing character of struggles, and they put at the core of their intervention in the history of historical materialism the history of the workers' movement and the history of what they call cycles of struggle. So they try to understand the way that the structure of class struggle is historically transformed through different cycles of struggle that have to do with the way that that the history of accumulation restructures the relation between capital and labor. And this is a very complex theoretical itinerary, but at the very core of it is the idea that communism, against Badiou, communism is not a transhistorical invariant. Communism is not an idea of communism which is a regulative ideal. Rather, it's a limit. It's a limit point of the breaking through of class struggles within the terms of the capitalist class relation. And they try to think the way in which that limit moves around and is differentially transformed through history. And they have a practice, over 40 years of just like writing up reports on contemporary struggles and thinking through their implications and theorizing the way in which the economy has also transformed the structure of the class relation. So Théorie communiste, in my opinion, these are the most important thinkers in historical materialism since Marx. I'm not kidding. I mean, that's how seriously I take their way of addressing the history of the class relation. And it's because they draw the consequences for communist theory from the history of the transformation of the class relation. And so, in my opinion, there's always a primacy of practice. One has to learn from particular struggles, and one has to theorize, remake theory on that basis. While at the same time, it's an important question. Why can one do that within a Marxist framework? Because Marx's theory is coherent and rigorous enough. It's systematically coordinated enough that it can be transformed, that it can be revised in accordance with its own parameters. And so I try to theorize that through this, section in the chapter on Marx on the proletariat. And I think you've read that paper before. Secondly, Badiou, I mean, I agree with you. I don't have the chops with category theory to understand, the proof that he offers in chapter 3 or part 3 of Logique des Mondes, of this like punctuating point of the ontological and the ontic. And I think that we've talked about this before. So, I mean, that's like a mathematical category theoretical, proof that he tries to offer of this link, of this point, of the suturing of the ontological to the ontic. And, but it doesn't matter that much to me whether I can reproduce that demonstration, let's put it that way, because the import for me of Badiou's thinking, particularly insofar as I'm concerned with it, the theory of the event, what's so interesting about what he does is that the event is that which is not being. So all the ontological framework that Badiou offers is sort of delimit, it delimits the point at which we can see where that which is not being might take place, as an event. And however one thinks about that, metaphysically, I'm actually not too worried about it. And I try to make this clear in my chapter on Badiou. What I'm concerned about is actually, I do think that that it's extremely useful to think about elements of political situations in this way, where when one decides to commit oneself to what has happened as something which is new and demands radically different forms of orientation toward a situation, then you are in this position where you decide, okay, tonight, do we take back the public square? Do we press through the police lines or not? Are we willing to venture and to risk ourselves in breaking through this line of riot police, or do we concede, the square that the police have taken back from us until tomorrow or the next day or whatever? That's what Badiou calls a point. And I think that this, so in the chapter on Badiou, I give the example of the renaming of Frank Ogawa Plaza as Oscar Grant Plaza in Oakland, and the renaming then of the sequence as like the Oakland Commune rather than Occupy Oakland. And the way that these specify, let's say, sort of grounds of commitment or criteria that you can see and feel within the process of subjective commitment to the unfolding of the thing on its own terms. And I think all of that is just like, it really clarifies a lot. If you sort of give a slightly deflationary, account of it, which you have yourself in the Politics of Prescription. And I continue to find that a very useful way of thinking about these things. And then the final question about time. So, the major thing that I try to do in the chapter on Meillassoux and Hegel, chapter 4 of the book, is basically to read Meillassoux as carrying forward the consequences of Heidegger's thinking of the ontological difference. And Meillassoux is a thinker of being is time. Heidegger says toward the end of Being in Time, temporalization is the absolutely outside of itself, in and for itself. That's the limit that Heidegger gets to in Being in Time. And I'm not one of these people who thinks that, oh, Heidegger didn't complete his project in Being in Time, and then there's this turn and he tries to rethink everything. No, I think that Heidegger absolutely completes the entire itinerary of his philosophical project in Being and Time, and it ends in that enunciation, which can be understood as the fundamental exteriority of time to subjective synthesis, which thereby opens the subject to the thinking of being in the very ecstasis of temporalization, which makes the human animal what it is, Dasein, a being which is open to the question of being qua being. And I think that I think that Heidegger is right, that whenever we reduce ontology to the ontic, whenever we use the word ontology to refer to something that is actually a question about beings, particular beings, as so many people do these days, when we use the word ontology in that sense, it is an instance of the forgetting of being, and that radical exteriority of time in Heidegger is thought through an existential analytic, okay, but it opens up on the pure exteriority of temporalization per se. And I think that in Meillassoux, that's the way in which this, destroys in Heideggerian terms the Kantian transcendental, although he derives it from it and has the utmost respect again for Kant. And I think that Meillassoux is a thinker, this is clear in the dissertation, of absolute time which can't be synthesized by phenomenal appearing and which can't be encountered by the time of science. So in order to grasp, I would say, Meillassoux' theory of time, we have to think three different modalities of time. One which is phenomenological, one which is scientific, that goes beyond, for example, the existence of human animals who synthesize time through their forms of intuition. And three, ontological time, which in Meillassoux is pure contingency. For example, becoming as that which includes the becoming of laws, beyond the laws of becoming. And this way of formulating the question in the dissertation, I find extremely clarifying, that the whole thing actually operates around this question. Are there only the laws of becoming, or is there also a becoming of laws? And if there is a becoming of laws, on what grounds can we think it? Well, they can't be ontic and they can't be scientific. They have to be ontological. We have to reason. And so there is a vertiginous, sort of the falling back of reason upon itself in Meillassoux' attempt to demonstrate the necessity of contingency. What he tries to show in the dissertation is that it has to be thought. He does that in a different way through the relation between physical or philosophical positions and after finitude. But he offers a demonstration, which I think is actually quite compelling, in the dissertation, that the necessity of contingency has to be thought. And that the difference between contingency and the necessity of contingency is the very criterion of the ontological difference. And what it gives us to think is a time of becoming, which is irreducible to the laws of becoming. And that becomes in Meillassoux the very criterion of the ontological difference. And in my opinion, he's the only one that has pushed forward the Heideggerian project in this respect. So as you know, Badiou has no theory of time whatsoever in his ontology as it pertains to being. And that's the great difference, I think, between Meillassoux and Badiou. So it's a complicated thing, and I try to work it out as well as I can in chapter 4, which nearly killed me to write. So we'll see if it holds up to scrutiny. Joe, yeah.
Hi, Nathan. That was great, and yeah, I'm eating it up, and it was wonderful. And actually, my question I was thinking all along is, I think, related to Joshua's and Peter's, and I guess Manish's last comment, and asking you again about Badiou, because in addressing like this thing in Badiou that was just kind of reiterated about the need to decide and name. I'm wondering about the transition between how you start naming in Badiou. So for like mathematics, as Manish was saying, in mathematics, which can begin naming and names a void and keeps naming point by point, letter by letter, symbol by symbol. But like you said in Badiou, the event, like mathematics cannot encounter or name the event. And this he says what Mallarmé can do that mathematics cannot do, which is actually encounter, symbolize an event, which mathematics cannot do, but Mohammedan's mathematical language can, which is exactly what you're saying, is the undecidable that then, so this is what, but I think everyone, like when they're asking you about Badiou and about this like sort of, or what Peter called the appearance of being, you know, like, or the presence, this presence that comes up in the event. You then go to basically what happens after the event, which is the fidelity and the naming, the subjectivity, or the subject is form. But then there's what happens before, which is like something else. So basically, like, is there ever in rational empiricism, is there a point where there is like an interruption, an event or something where mathematically it brings you up to the event? And then how you describe it is you kind of like begin afterwards again by saying it has to name again. But that's what's mathematics can actually go through that. It kind of like brings you up to it, and it kind of then kind of continues on. And I was thinking also, you can kind of see this like in Derrida when you talk about like the trace. And I think I was listening to a lecture the other day by you too, about the trace, you know, I think the trace is helpful when thinking about time as well, with Peter's question and the repetition of time. But, you know, like when in dissemination and the truth in painting, you know, with the blank and the frame are like outside. And Derrida also kind of experiences like the sublime interruption that sends him back to erase a trace, sign the other, and continue again. So there's actually like this, and even when Derrida, and even though Derrida and Badiou are not in the same ballpark, and they're in different directions, even in Derrida, there's this play of between one trace and another trace. There's this play between obviously the impression, as you started off at defining empiricism, there's a play between the initial impression and like this blank, which finally leads to this like sublime shock that sends it back. So I was just wondering, like in rational empiricism, and I think this is what other people are asking in a way, in rational empiricism, is there a way where it leads up to an undecidable that then begins naming again, or is it really just kind of continuous? Continuous discontinuity, or whatever you want to put it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, so let me, in a minute, I'll take it up extremely concretely.
Yeah, thanks.
Question about Badiou, but you know, before that, there is no general answer to that question in like rationalist empiricism. So that is to say, the relation between reason and experience works in mathematics, or sorry, in science, in a very different way than it does in a political sequence. And again, it works in a very different way within you know, ontological thinking than it does within like the practical experience of a political sequence. But I think that there's a way in which, you know, what Badiou says is extremely simple. So I'll just try to give, you know, I'll just give the concrete example of it that I give in the chapter that I just mentioned to Peter. So it's not, you know, I think this sort of game of being like, was this an event? Was that an event? Is this an event? Is that an event? Is it an event or not? You know, I don't really care at the end of the day. And in fact, it doesn't really matter because people have to decide that for themselves in concrete situations. But what does it really mean if we take it seriously, but also sort of deflate, you know, the like metaphysical excesses of this language? What it means is that something happens, okay? So I'll just give you the sequence. The Occupy movement begins in New York. Occupy Oakland begins in late September in Oakland. When Occupy Oakland begins, okay, first of all, there's a thing called Occupy Oakland now, that there wasn't before. Then there's a renaming of the square, Oscar Grant Plaza. Then there's a redesignation in a way of Occupy Oakland as the Oakland Commune, which you know, has these sort of hyperbolic perhaps effects, but in a way important effects of thinking about this as in a communist continuum, as a communist practice, you know, and differentiating it in that way perhaps from other occupations which don't necessarily claim that trajectory. Whether that matters or not is to be decided in the situation. But one thing that becomes very clear in this way, which is partisan, is that if someone doesn't call Oscar Grant Plaza, but rather continues to refer to it as Franco-Gawa Plaza, they're not partisans of the unfolding of this political sequence. Or maybe they are, and they have different reasons for that, which can be negotiated and debated or whatever. That becomes part of the very question. But the nomination opens the question and becomes constitutive. And it seems like a small thing, but it's not, because it decides the criteria of partisanship. So for example, in that occupation, it was decided no police within the square, no obedience to civil authorities or regulations. And so if someone, that can be a point of argument. But if someone just thinks, we should allow police into the square, we should obey the civic regulations about noise, et cetera, then they basically separate themselves from the movement, which is nominated by these, by these things. They declare themselves to be on a different political line, or it becomes a matter of dispute. The very fact that it can become a matter of dispute is evidence enough of the intervention in that situation. And what's important is that there is no common measure for deciding, is the square called Oscar Grant Plaza or is it called Franco-Gawa Plaza? To a bureaucrat of the city administration, it's just called Franco-Gawa Plaza, and it doesn't make any sense to call it Oscar Grant Plaza. That has no meaning, or it only has meaning for these lunatics who have committed themselves to something which has no future. And over and over again, that's played out. These people living in their own world and their delirious, political subjectivization no longer speak the same language as us. That's strictly true. And what that shows you is that in that sequence, commitment, to the unfolding of what happens is endlessly negotiated, such that there is no one subject of the Oakland Commune. And nobody even knows what's going on at any given time, or what the line is, or whatever. It's constantly open to negotiation and debate. It's a collective subject, which is not unified, which is divided within itself. Yet there are criteria for operating within it. And there are criteria for being expelled from it. And these are the sort of questions. And then that opens up these questions. What do we do now or then? Do we, it was put to the General Assembly, have a general strike in Oakland on a certain date in November, or do we not? And there was, and that opened up a completely unexpected shutting down of the port by 40,000 people, the Port of Oakland, that would have seemed like utterly impossible a month before, a total pipe dream. So these things happen, and they happen because of these modes of subjective commitment to what may be possible in the future that does not seem possible in the present, and that people outside of the sequence do not recognize as even existing. And that's the import of Furet's argument about the French Revolution, relayed by Bruno Latour in We Have Never Been Modern. There was no such thing as the French Revolution. These are just stories that people told themselves. Well, that's exactly true, but it has to be thought of in a partisan way, rather than in this false objectivity which belies its own partisanship. So these things are not, mathematics has nothing to do with what happens during an event. That's why the theory of the subject is not the theory of being. What the trajectory of a subject has to do with is the decision, which is coeval with the event itself, that is to say, its nomination. And then one coordinates one's actions with reference to the future anterior. These things sound so arcane and bizarre in Badiou's theory, but I think they're, I actually tend to think that they're more or less self-evident within the unfolding of political sequences, as long as one is able to think about the way that they just refer to things which actually people recognize and actually do in political sequences.
Yeah, I agree. I was just thinking of particularly of Mahomet, because that's how the poem starts. Just like it seems like what you're saying is, it starts with naming a void, then the negation, then the annulment, then the naming of it again, the disappearing ship, then the disappearing siren, then the disappearing, and then the foreclosure. So there is the naming 3 times actually of the negation, of the structural dialectic, of leading up to the event. And then at the end, there's the event between the disappearing feather or the siren and in one poem, you know, it's between the two, or between an Anku Day would be between like the feather and the constellation. You know, so actually it brings you up to the event, which is then undecidable. Then you continues. You know, so there actually, you know, that's what I was saying. There's like an event in between that almost, rather than just continuing on. Does that make sense? Because how you're describing it is almost like how Badiou starts reading the poem, which then leads up to the event, you know, and then there's the naming of the event, which Badiou forces, you know, the fidelity to name it again, you know, so it is like what you're saying, but there's also an event in between. I don't know. That's why I was just wondering. Yeah.
Oh, well, let's talk about it. We can talk about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Afterwards, but I think I certainly think that kind of retroactive structure is there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Me too. Thanks.
Justin. Yeah.
Hey, Nathan, really good to see you. And this has been super interesting and enlightening. So I'm sort of worried that this is a question that's like a little bit outside of your project and your thinking, but it has sort of to do with the way you described sort of like coordinating rationalism and empiricism via Stiegler's account of inscription. So what I sort of want to ask is that, like, you know, because part of Stiegler's, you know, deconstruction of deconstruction, as he puts it, entails this almost sort of like splitting of the, or not splitting is maybe not the right word, but this lumping on to the Derridian problematic of inscription with this sort of like cinematic, you know, like arca cinema, right, as this other sort of different fundamental mode that subtends thought. And like Catherine Malibu says sort of similar things when she talks about form and figure, right, that the trace will never efface the figure or something to that effect. So I'm just sort of curious, like, if this plays any role with your thinking, or if you're just sort of like not interested in this aspect of Stiegler's attempt to kind of like complicate Derrida. Yeah.
The cinematic aspect of his thought.
Yeah.
I would have to say no. I guess I would have to admit that I'm not particularly interested in it. You know, with Stiegler, I'm really a one-trick pony. It's volume 1 of Technics in Time, and that's it. And after that, I think there's, in my opinion, a great falling off in the significance of the work. But I think that Technics in Time Volume 1 is a truly important work of philosophy. So, I mean, in thinking about the importance of the trace of inscription, you know, as I said, what it in itself implies no coordination of the rational and the empirical. But what it allows us to think, contra, you know, Kant, in a way that is relayed by Derrida's text on Husserl's Origin of Geometry, is again the exteriorizing advent of thought, that thought in its very advent is thrown outside the synthetic, well, precisely the synthetic determination of phenomena by categories. That is to say, there's something about the advent of thought that relies upon, on the one hand, a psychological economy, a psychic economy that has to do with memory, and this is what Stiegler theorizes in such exquisite detail, that the capacity for anticipation is opened by the exteriorizing force of like mnemotechnics, you know, of writing and recording, which is extremely interesting, you know, that basically the difference between the human and the animal is opened by recording as inscription. And all I want to do, you know, is then think about how that's operative on the one hand in the sort of like the critique of the origin that we find in Derrida and Stiegler, but on the other hand, in every act of scientific practice. And in this way, let me say something positive about Bruno Latour. You know, I very much admire Latour's early work on scientific laboratories and inscription, you know, because empirically, it sort of shows us these practices that go on with, like, you know, technologies and writing practices and in laboratories, you know, and I think that all of that work up to science and action is extremely important. Of course, within its limits, you know, but a way of thinking about inscription as the crux of experiment and formalization, and therefore as the crux of the rational and the empirical, puts inscription at the very heart of scientific practice and scientific theory, in fact. And therefore it gives us to think the way in which, you know, that exteriority of thought to itself through inscription has always been at the very heart of our ability to record anything about the phenomena and to relay it generationally. And so that's what I think is so important about Stiegler. The theory of inscription in Stiegler does not in itself give us a theory of the relation between the rational and the empirical. I just try to mobilize it as this sort of crux of how to think about the relation between formalization and experiment. Other questions?
Andre Ferlani has his hand up.
Oh, wonderful. Hey, Andre. I can't hear you.
It's usually better that way. In terms of the use of inscription here, it reminds me of, I mean, mathematics has come up a lot in the discussion, and these debates certainly, you know, range freely across the 20th century and formalist accounts of mathematics. And I guess my question is about whether it's an issue of inscription or of application. So, you know, like in a formalist account, you know, a calculus operates by agreement, you know, not by justification. The technique is a construction that holds good, you know, rather than is the discovery of a kind of a necessary truth. And so, you know, mathematical formulas are presented as being petrifactions that are, you know, that are immune to experience, right? That can't be overturned by experience. And mathematical signs are guided, was a rule-guided use of verbal practices, in our verbal practices, right? So their use outside of mathematics, however, and thus, you know, their meaning, transforms a play of signs into mathematics proper. Okay, this is like inscription application. You know, mathematics isn't just lines and scratches, because after all, we count with our fingers, we count chairs, etc. You don't want to distinguish. Well, there's no question of giving those signs a meaning apart from their application. So it's essential to mathematics that its signs should be employed experientially, or in some way in experience. So given that premise, if one even agrees to it, does the principle of application subsume inscription, or is it a symptom of inscription? Do you see what I mean? You know, we inscribe it, we end up with this concept of application. It seems to me application is like primitive to inscription, and yet is fundamental to the shift from a rational, speculative formula to an experiential body of something of knowledge.
Yeah. It's a great question. Thank you. So I think there are two grounds on which I want to answer it. So, you know, one would have to do with the importance of mathematical signs and of equations and of formulas in scientific practice. The other would have to do with Badiou's ontological mobilization of like set theory to think, you know, being qua being. And so let me begin with Badiou, which is a sort of different question. And again, Badiou, don't mistake me. So Badiou's theory of ontology for me is not an instance of rationalist empiricism. That is pure rationalism. Okay, it's the theory of the subject that I take up as a theory of this coordination of the rational and the empirical and the shuttling between them. There can be no experience of being qua being. This would be actually rebuke to Heidegger. You know, this sort of like, let's say, aestheticization of the opening of being, et cetera. In fact, I might be closer to Heidegger myself in this question. The more I listen to Wagner, the more I get myself in trouble. But I would say that, you know, in Badiou, it's very important that there can be no experience. There can be no presentation of being qua being. You know, it's subtracted from presentation. When it's counted as one, and now it enters in. And so the import of transfinite set theory for Badiou is that it gives one a sort of system of formalism which is sufficiently abstract to think the inconsistency of multiplicity without subtracted from the consistency of presentation, that is to say, the form of the object. And, you know, in Badiou, you mentioned counting on one's fingers, which is an example of, you know, the basis and intuition of mathematical reasoning. It's very important for Badiou that we cannot think, you know, for example, and there are many other examples, but like we can't follow the demonstrations and the, you know, the proofs of transfinite set theory by counting on our fingers. That is to say, there's something which radically goes beyond intuition in the complexity of the development of mathematics, which Kant in certain ways must be well aware of. However, it's true, and on this point, Kant is exactly right, that we do need to write things down. You know, a mathematician may, in their head, reason about a proof, work through a proof, but eventually one has to write down in order to transmit it and probably in order to solve it. You know, one has to inscribe the enchainment of mathematical formulae, of mathematical signs in order to follow and reason about their development. And there, right there, there's already a dimension of the relationship between experience and reason. Maybe I'm now compromising what I said to Justin. Maybe in the very act of inscription, there is a putting down of what is reasoned and a receptivity, you know, to what one reasons about. To the writing, to mathematical writing, which Badiou always insists on. But the other dimension of it, which would be more important, would be the application of equations and numbers in scientific practice, in scientific practice itself. And so here, you know, I use this kilogram example because it's just an amazing instance of what happens with number in the history of science. So, you know, the Planck constant is a number. And the number is a measure of the minimal unit of electromagnetic action. And what they do when they redefine the kilogram to correlate it with the Planck constant, to correlate it mass with energy in this way, with the constant, is they have to measure the Planck constant itself. Now, what happens is very interesting because you would think, okay, if the Planck number is just the value of the Planck constant in itself, how can it be measured? How can it be revised? But they do, they make the measurement more and more accurate. But you know what they do then? And this is really fascinating. So now the speed of light in a vacuum, c, the physical constant c, has been fixed. It has no assignment of uncertainty anymore. The same is true now of the Planck number after they remeasured it in correlation with the kilogram. So you know what happens? They get this thing down to like, I think it's like 20 parts per billion is the degree of uncertainty required for the consensus of the redefinition. And once they get 3 of those measurements within that threshold, they average them. They decide on the number, and now that number just is the number, and it has no degree of uncertainty anymore assigned to it. But where does that uncertainty go? It goes into the definition of the kilogram. And because now the Planck constant is also defined in relation to the kilogram. And now when you realize the kilogram, when you do the experimental practice to like check on the value, to realize the value, which everyone has to be able to do for an international agreement on the value of the kilogram, Planck number at its set value. And you coordinate it with the mass of the kilogram. And the uncertainty is in the experiment. It's proper to the experiment itself, which is part of the definition of the kilogram. So now the uncertainty of the Planck has shifted to the apparatus of the experiment and the very practice of the experiment. And so this is something where we fix a number, and we eliminate the uncertainty of its value, but it persists in an empirical setting. So what's interesting here is that we could only formalize the Planck constant or discover that it exists in the first place because we invented the metric system, and it enabled partly all of these like more sophisticated ways of understanding nature. And now we recursively.
Yeah.
So it's just an example of how the very value of a number, depends on the relay between the rational and the empirical, and the capacity actually to flip it over, to turn that relay over on itself recursively. And that's a historical dialectic which unfolds across a century. And now it's done. That's the number. So these things are interesting. And I think to understand them, one has to follow these experimental histories and practices. But all I try to insist on is that there can be no experimental practices at all without this relay between the rational and the empirical, number and experiment and apparatus.
Sure, this kind of relay between sense data and norms. I mean, to put it in the crudest terms, but it does remind me, of course, that famously flagrant remark, maybe it's in the investigations where Wittgenstein says, the engineer Wittgenstein says, the Paris meter is not a meter.
Well, that's true. That's true. The Paris meter is incomparable, and that's the whole problem. That's why it had to be replaced. Same with the kilogram, because you can no longer measure the degree to which the mass has like floated or varied from its original mass. You can't measure it because it is the kilogram. So in that sense, it is not a kilogram, it is the kilogram. So, I mean, that's why they redefine these units, because they weren't sufficiently accurate and one can't check on their accuracy. I guess we have some time for like one or two final questions. I'm happy to talk as long
Thank you.
as 7 and people go if you want to stay.
Right, I have to go. That was a terrific answer, and I very, very much look forward to seeing the book. And I'm very sorry that we're not all in a group in a
all
festive setting.
Couldn't be here if we were, so it's nice in this format actually. But nice to see you, Andre. Thanks for the question. Any further questions to take up?
I have a question.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, apologies if this is a question that's already been addressed, but do you think that this notion of rationalist empiricism can potentially be read as another variant of what mayors who call correlationism? For instance, when you say that you want to defend Mayer's thesis of the capacity of science to describe properties in the object in itself, something, something that Mayers hasn't actually demonstrated in a way perhaps he would be satisfied with. So when you say you want to defend this, is there a way, some sort of a naive epistemological question can be asked, like this whole idea of experience is valid only insofar as there is a thinking subject outside of which it has no meaning? So how can we really say that this is actually about the in itself, or in a classical Kantian sense?
Yeah, I can try to. I mean, so on the one hand, it's crucial here to differentiate between the ontic and the ontological. So between the two senses of the in itself in Meillassoux, and if one doesn't sort of like get clear on this distinction, then everything is sort of lost, because on the one hand, he means the capacity of science to determine the properties of objects through reference to those properties as they are in themselves. That is to say, that's the reference of the determination of science, not what the objects are for us, but the actual properties of the object. And secondly, to think the in itself at an ontological level, the in itself as it pertains to being qua being. So these are completely different problems. And but the first problem, the way that science operates with reference to the properties of objects in themselves, I think the theory that I offer is not a correlationism, because, you know, I'm committed to the fact that the relay between experiments using technological apparatuses with radically different receptive capacities than those of human beings, and on the other hand, the mathematical formalisms, the systems of equations in which the results of those experiments are understood and systematized with physical theory, that the relay between those two elements of scientific practice filters out, you know, the phenomenological givenness of experience. That's the whole point of it, such that the categories of our own, of any possible experience for a human subject do not delimit the receptivity of technological instruments and their coordination with mathematical formalizations. And that's the whole point of the use of technology in science. And so at that level, you know, then I offer this category of provisional objectivity. So is that, do I concede in some way on Meillassoux theory? I think absolutely not, because of course Meillassoux knows and states in After Finitude, scientific knowledge is revisable. There's no way to think about the reference of any scientific fact, any scientific determination of an object in a way that you don't admit that it's open to revision through the future of science. Of course it is, and Meillassoux states that clearly. He knows this. The point is, however, that the reference of the scientific determination is about the property of the object as it is separable from our knowledge of the object. Now, of course, we determine, the reference operates in terms of equations, for example, or mathematical determinations that we can understand, but they're determinations of the property of the object, whether we exist or not. That's what they refer to. They don't simply exist to the phenomenal appearing of the object for us. And that's the import of the filtration of phenomenal immediacy out of scientific experiment and formalization. The second question is that in terms of the other reference to the in itself as thinking ontologically, I mean, here the whole, insofar as I try to defend, I try to explain, I try to clarify how Meillassoux thinks about the necessity of contingency in the dissertation. And the arguments are very different, and they're better than After Finitude, much better. And what I think is at issue is, the way in which the very thinking of the absolute cancels the absolute scope of thinking itself. It shows that the thinking of any finite being and thought per se, which has emerged in the time of the cosmos, may cease to exist, and that we can think, and enunciate the very principle by which reason forces us to accede to the principle that thought is itself contingent and not absolute. But it's capable of thinking that principle. There's no contradiction there. And so in the very advent of the thought of the necessity of contingency, one thinks the contingency of thinking itself. And that's the non-correlational aspect of the ontological reasoning of l'inexistence divine. And the demonstration there is, it's very interesting. So all I can do, I can't, I translated it, it's in Parisia, and you can read it and evaluate it, but yeah. So my hope is that I certainly think that I've tried to produce an account both of the ontic practice of science and of the ontological reasoning of philosophy that is not correlationist, insofar as it forces us beyond the transcendental grounds of possible experience. Any other questions that are pressing upon people's minds before we go? Peter, is that okay, you're gonna, thanks, Peter. We'll talk soon.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much. That was really great.
Well, maybe it's time to adjourn. It's been a long evening, unless anyone want to get something in just before we go. Okay.
Let's all thank Nathan once again for the lecture and for fielding all those questions. That was a tremendous performance. As always, very richly informative. Thanks everybody for being here. Congrats, Nathan. Huge achievement.
Thanks for organizing this, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's a real pleasure to see all of you.
Let's get back together again to celebrate the Baudelaire project.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Manish.